Okay, here we go. Lesson 1, part 2. Let's actually look at the main ideas that the cognitive scientists or the proponents of science of reading have been putting forth for decades. Let's have a little bit of a look at the specifics of them, because they have been saying that focusing on teaching children using balanced literacy strategies is actually detrimental to them learning how to read. Not just not a good idea, but actually detrimental. Okay, so balanced literacy is based on using what is called the 3 cueing system. Now, there is some structured teaching of phonics, but the basis for teaching students to read is this 3 cue system. So basically, there's when a teacher is teaching a student how to read using balanced literacy, they have a book in front of them, and this is how they teach them to read. So they ask the student, does what you're reading make sense? Is there, does the word make sense? So if a child specifically makes an error, so say they say something like, the cot ate its food. Would that make sense? So a teacher would say, well, does that make sense? And the child would say, well, no, cots don't really eat food, they don't eat food, so it must have been the cat ate its food. So that's what it would make sense. Then there's the structural code. So for an example, if a child said the running was white, having running in that spot doesn't actually sound right. So then they would maybe go back and say, oh, well, what would make sense there? What would make sense there would be like the rabbit was white. That leads into sort of a little bit of the visual. So if they look at the starting letter, and then they could say, well, if it's not running, rabbit kind of makes sense. So that actually fits. And maybe there's a picture with a rabbit there. So then they get that, they use the context of the book. There's also the visual code breaker. Does it actually look right? So, or something like, we tromped through the woods. When it was actually traveled, it looks correct. So it's kind of like, well, that's actually a pretty good guess. That's a pretty good guess about that word. And then the teacher would say, that's a good guess, but it's actually traveled instead of tromped. Okay, and then students again are encouraged in the early years to look at the pictures to help. So, however, know that this idea of teaching children to read by asking, does it make sense? Does it look right? Does it sound right? Is absolutely being challenged by cognitive scientists, reading specialists, and teachers, as they are finding that more and more students are not learning to read using this system to an adequate level by grade 3. And grade 3 is kind of the crunch year that if they're not at grade level of reading, they will be behind in their reading level for their entire schooling career, which you are probably starting to see how devastating that is. If there's a child in grade 6 and they're reading at a grade 2 level, it is so difficult for that child to figure out what is going on. Okay, so let's have a look at this type of reading pedagogy, and assessment is really falling out of favor. So even when I started teaching here 7 years ago, the course that when I was teaching specifically 371, the instructor before me said, okay, make sure that you teach the students how to do a running record, because balanced literacy was absolutely the dominant idea of how to teach literacy. So this is where you have a child, this is the sort of the assessment, and then you have the child, if they read something, and then whenever they make a mistake, then you try to figure out why they made the mistake. Did they not understand the meaning? Did they not understand the syntax? Or is it a visual thing? They just didn't recognize words. But this is really sort of falling out of favor. And I'll show you some of the discussion that is going on. So this was posted on the Canadian Science of Reading Facebook page. It's called Canadian Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College, Facebook page. And so if you're interested in becoming part of that, just go on and say, I'd like to be a member. And they have amazing, amazing information about science of reading. And this is actually, look at what, this is in Arkansas. Arkansas passed a bill basically making the 3 queuing system illegal in public schools for grades K to 2. So balanced literacy is really, really taking a hit right now, in that their whole system of of teaching students how to read is absolutely being challenged. And the 3 queuing system, which is, I'm going to go back here, which is this is how you teach a child to read, is absolutely under attack. And this is actually, I'm going to just let you know a quote that I also got off the Canadian Science of Reading, and this is from an Ontario teacher. And he wrote, "I'm thrilled that some states are moving away from the 3 queuing system as a method of reading instruction. It is so detrimental and ineffective for our readers, often at the cost of self-esteem and feelings of self-worth. For the past 20 years, I have approached and asked the Ontario Ministry of Education and school boards all across Ontario to provide effective reading instruction based on the science of reading. I genuinely hope that school districts are listening and changing." And so I actually found, this was a letter from a different teacher in Ontario in March 2022. And I'm going to read the second bullet here. So they are saying, thank you to the Ministry of Education for making major changes in how we teach literacy in Ontario and ultimately across Canada. So they wrote here, revising the elementary language curriculum in the grade 9 English course with the scientific evidence-based approaches that emphasize direct, explicit, and systematic instruction, and removing references to unscientific discovery and inquiry-based learning, including the 3 queuing system by 2023. So by fall 2023, teachers in Ontario, as a mandate of the Ministry of Education, will not be allowed to use the 3 queuing system, which is the fundamental idea behind balanced literacy. Okay, so I want to kind of tell you a couple stories, or read you a couple stories about why is focusing on teaching reading with 3 queuing system or balanced reading ideology detrimental. I should say balanced literacy there, just to not confuse you. Balanced literacy ideology detrimental. So I'm going to just read you a few quotes from researchers, and then I'm going to read you some stories from Molly and Margaret. So several of these interventions and curricula operate under the understanding that students use multiple sources of information or cues to solve words. Those can include the letters on the page, the context in which the page appears, pictures, or the grammatical structure of the sentence. So that's the fundamental concept behind balanced literacy. But our cognitive scientists suggest that skilled readers actually don't read this way. Skilled readers process all the letters in the word as they read them, and then they read the connected text very quickly. So they read the letters, or they decode the letters, and then they put them together and read them quickly. They do not try to memorize the words, they don't skip words, or they don't use the context to guess words. They actually decode the words. So they see C-A-T, they go k-at, they go cat, and they actually decode. They don't look at a picture and see that there's a cat in the picture and then try to figure out what's going on there. Skilled readers use orthographic mapping. They pay attention to the details of the written word, not the overall written word, but the details of the specific word. Observational studies show that poor readers do use different sources of information to predict what words might say. They will opt for other ways to figure out words because phonics is challenging. If there's somebody who's actually been able to figure out the whole reading thing without having to actually decode, we all go for the least path of resistance. But ultimately, those students are going to come up to situations where they don't know the word and they have no other way to decode it. The queuing system seems easier at the beginning, but when they get to the 3rd grade, those cues don't work anymore. There are no more pictures. The concepts are more advanced. They start to become more conceptual versus practical, those kind of things. And it also sends messages to kids that they do not have to sound out the words. So if you just say, well, just guess at the word. What do you think it is? They never really get the idea that they need those decoding. They need those decoding skills. Okay, so I want to read you a story about Molly. So sit back, grab another coffee, and listen to Molly's story. Molly Woodworth was a kid who seemed to do well at everything, good grades in the gifted and talented program, but she couldn't read very well. There was no rhyme or reason to reading for me, she said. When a teacher would dictate a word and say, "Tell me how you think you can spell it," I sat there with my mouth open while other kids gave spellings, and I thought, how do they even know where to begin? I was totally lost. Woodworth went to a public school in Michigan in the 1990s. She says sounds and letters just didn't make sense to her, and she doesn't remember anyone teaching her how to read or decode. So she came up with her own strategies to get through the text. Strategy 1, see if these are starting to sound familiar. She is a struggling reader. She memorized as many words as possible. Words were like pictures to me, she said. I have a really good memory. She guessed the words based on context. And if all else fails, she'd skip the words she didn't know. Sound familiar? Balanced literacy. Okay, so most of the time she could get the gist of what she was reading, but getting through the text took forever. I hated reading, she said, because it was taxing. I'd get through a chapter and my brain would hurt by the end. I wasn't excited to learn. No one knew how much she struggled, not even her parents. Her reading strategies were what she called her dirty little secrets. So she was not proud of these strategies, which are the exact strategies that balanced literacy is proposing, or has proposed for decades. Okay, so Woodworth, who now works in accounting, says she's still not a very good reader and tears up when she talks about it. Reading influences every aspect of your life, she said. She's determined to make sure her own kids get off to a better start than she did. That's why she was so alarmed to see how her eldest child, Claire, was being taught to read in school. A couple years ago, Woodworth was volunteering in Claire's kindergarten class. The class was reading a book together, and her teacher was telling the children to practice the strategies that good readers use. The teacher said, "If you don't know the word, just look at this picture up here." Woodworth recalled, there was a fox and a bear in the picture, and the word was bear. And she said, "Look at the first letter. It's a B. Is it a fox or a bear?" Woodworth was stunned. She said, "I thought, oh my goodness, those are my strategies. Those are the things I taught myself to look like a good reader, not the things that good readers do." She said, "These kids are being taught my dirty little secrets." She went to the teacher and expressed her concerns. The teacher told her she was teaching reading the way the curriculum told her to. And I want to read you a short story about Margaret. Margaret, a teacher and literacy coach in the Oakland Unified School District, remembers the moment when she realized what a problem the 3Qing approach was. She was with a first grader named Rodney when he came to a page with a picture of a girl licking an ice cream cone and a dog eating a bone. So you'll see that picture on the slide. The text said, "My little dog likes to eat with me." But Rodney said, "My dog likes to eat the bone." Rodney breezed right through it, unaware that he hadn't read the sentence on the page. Goldberg realized lots of her students couldn't actually read the words in their books. Instead, they were memorizing sentence patterns and using the pictures to guess. One little boy explained, "I could read this book with my eyes shut." Oh no, Goldberg thought, that is not reading. Okay, so that is why the balanced literacy is going, there are some aspects of it that are absolutely on the out. There are still some aspects like inspiring students to read and giving them lots of genres of reading that are still there. But the basis of actually how to teach students to learn is much more focused on the science of reading, which is absolutely focused on a systematic, structured way of teaching phonics and decoding. Okay, so Balanced literacy proponents, they say that it's a mix of phonics instruction with plenty of time for kids to read and enjoy books. But if you look carefully at the materials, and we're going to look a little bit at this as a class, you'll see that that's not really what balanced literacy is mixing. It's mixing a bunch of ideas about how kids learn to read. There's a little bit of whole word instruction with long lists of words for kids to memorize, like all those sight words. You might have heard about sight words. It's a little bit of phonics, and fundamentally it's the idea that children should be taught to read using the 3 cueing system. And cognitive scientists are now saying that actually cueing may actually prevent kids from focusing on words in the way they need to become skilled readers, and because it encourages them to look away from the actual letters. Okay, so even with the cognitive scientists having spent 20, 25 years of showing us the scientific evidence, we as a school system, as an education system, both in the US and Canada, have absolutely grabbed onto this idea of balanced literacy. So these are 2019 stats, and these are in the US, but I would say that probably they're pretty accurate for Canada as well. So 75% of teachers are using the 3 cueing approach. So this was in 2019. So 75% of teachers were using the 3 cueing approach. 65% of teachers said that their districts selected their primary reading programs and materials, and while 27% said that the decision was up to their school. So you have a lot of teachers that are teaching balanced literacy because that is what is handed down to them from their district, which it's fair. It's a fair thing that they're teaching that because this is being handed down. All these resources are coming to them. All this money is being spent. But we have to go, is this actually the best way to teach reading? And if it's not, we and you have to say, no, this is not the best way to teach reading. Okay, so Sciences of Reading is putting forth that phonics instruction, and it's putting forth that a multitude of studies has shown that systematic, explicit, and I'm going to add in structured phonics is the most effective method for teaching early readers. Now, does this mean that we're just going to sit with kindergarten kids and do like, okay, kids, we're going to do all the phonics? No, we teach them, and I'm going to show you some really great ways to teach kids, but we have to teach them the sounds. We have to link those sounds to actual letters, and we have to get them to understand how to decode. What they're saying is that the 3 cueing system, introducing this method, is actually detrimental to a child learning to read. So they're not just saying it's not just a little bit bad. It's bad. It's bad. And so we're going to talk a little about, education always does the pendulum swing, like balanced literacy. Now nobody wants to do balanced literacy. Now we're all doing science of reading, and in 20 years maybe we're all swinging back to something else. So we're going to talk a little bit about what can we take from balanced literacy, not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are some good things like the joy of reading, but the science of reading has a lot of evidence-based studies, and we are really finding that our students are struggling with reading pretty much across the board. And so we need to be looking at our ideas of teaching ELA, ideas of teaching literacy. Okay, so, are we full circle all the way back to phonics, all the way back to McGuffey in the 1800s? I don't think so. I think we've come a long way. I think science of reading is bringing in other aspects, but it's confusing. It's confusing for you as a new teacher, and hopefully through our discussions we can just talk a little bit about these ideas, because you as a new teacher, you have to have a really firm foundation of philosophy, of ideas, because you can see if you buy into science of reading, how you teach reading is going to look like this. If you buy into whole language, it's going to look like this. If you buy into balanced literacy, so you have to know your foundation of how you're going to teach, because that will impact everything that you do in the classroom. I think, oops, I'm on my wrong computer here. Let's go to this one. Okay, so this is super fun for you. You're in the midst of a reading war battle. You're in the midst of a curriculum change, which is exciting and scary. Hopefully we can work together so that we limit the scary and focus on the exciting. It ultimately is, as a professional, is yours to decide. So your philosophy of how to teach reading in ELA is yours to decide. You just have to remember that you are the most important part of a child learning to read. Awesome. Take care, everybody.